I would like to introduce Sarah Jaffe, who will be presenting a talk called Work Won't Love You Back.
Yeah, I guess I don't have to tell any of you much of anything about work not loving you back, huh? I do think that, yeah, I hate giving lectures. Let me just say this. There's a reason I'm not in academia. It's because I didn't want to teach. And so and I find these like both great. Hello, I love being virtually in California right now, but also like it's even harder to read the room, I guess, and tell when all of your eyes are glazing over when I'm talking to a screen, even though I can see like half of your faces right now. So I kind of prefer to just like do my talk quickly and then have a conversation, and you can ask me anything you want, from the AFL-CIO getting tagged and smashed up to the history of the failings of the UAW, or, you know, other fun questions that you might have. There are lots of them. I also wrote a book about protest movements, which is suddenly relevant again. And I feel like I'm trying to sort of mash all of these things together in a way that is like at least somewhat relevant. But yeah, I prefer less time of me spouting and more time letting you actually ask me what you really want to know rather than me trying to guess. So yeah, so The Work Won't Love You Back is the title of my upcoming book. And it is about the idea of the labor of love and the material conditions that most people actually work in. And the question of whether one should love one's job is not a sort of personal admonition, right? It's not like you're a bad person if you like what you do. I like what I do often. That also leaves me broke. But the question that I get asked a lot of the time is like, well, then what's the answer? Should you just like be miserable at your job? And it's like, no, the answer is ending wage labor. The answer is that all wage labor is exploitation. And the language of loving your work in particular, though, is used to drive down wages, break strikes, bust unions, extend working hours. It's a stick disguised as a carrot. It is worker control, right? It's there to get us to control ourselves. So, and it's a thread that runs through more and more work, because Joshua told me what is in his background over here, the declining manufacturing profits. I'm going to use that as a great example, because as manufacturing profits decline, where are more and more people working? They're not working in manufacturing, they're working in universities. As Thomas mentioned at the beginning, the fact that the University of California is the state's biggest employer is not an accident. Nor is the fact that, well, you know what, I don't have good numbers because of the current unemployment crisis, but before everybody got fired, retail was 10% of the economy. So, and then healthcare workers, teachers, other people who are, you know, being called essential workers right now. More and more of these people are now expected not just to show up and do their job like you did when you worked in manufacturing, and like people who still do work in manufacturing do, but you have to show up with a smile in some way or another, right? And then you are expected to do what you do with that smile, with some gratitude. When you're grad students, that's a big one, right? You're supposed to be grateful and pay your dues for a few years before you get to be a full professor, except that part is kind of slipping away. So yeah, I planned to spend most of my time talking about academic labor, which is kind of funny because all of you know more about it than I do. I was a grad student for 2 whole years at Temple. I was a grad student unionist myself, but I just have a master's. So higher education is a thing that, you know, has long existed to educate and train the ruling class for ruling. You know, higher education from imperial China to the pre-Columbian Americas was a way to train society's upper castes to keep all the rest of us in line. And it only even became a place for intellectual pursuits sort of as a secondary thing, and then even then still only for certain people. And the history of the university is still a history of power struggles, even from the beginning, between city and university, professor and student, church and university, state and university. And the opening of the university to this idea of upward mobility, this idea that you would get a degree and then get a better job than your parents had, right, is only basically a 20th century invention. You would move into what, Barbara and John Ehrenreich called the professional managerial class, right? And there are a lot of bad arguments made about the professional managerial class lately. I hate them deeply, 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 and I will explain more in a little bit why if you want. But even when they introduced this term, it was a complicated, messy one, but the conditions of it have certainly changed, as all of you once again know. So the PMC, giving that with a huge grain of salt, was the service and management professionals whose jobs required some level of education and gave them some level of autonomy, especially, and some level of power over others, right? So it was there to manage the working class. And it's always been sort of a weird mashup of two things, right? Like in the labor movement, we talk about management, we talk about the boss. Management is somewhat different than professional work, right? It's not the same thing to be a middle manager at Target as it is to be a professor at the University of California, right? But in both cases, you still do have some power over some people underneath you, whether those are your students, your employees, your graduate students who are both. And that's actually boring. I don't really want to talk about that. So a lot of the protections that were fought for in the university were in many ways to protect access to it for people who had not been expected to be the class going to the university. So, up until like the 1950s, most faculty did not have tenure. They did not have that much protection. People fought for tenure not really to protect radical agitation or troublemakers or, Marxist professors, but to make everybody's job a little bit more secure. But of course, tenure has always been valuable to protect academic freedom. And also to protect the jobs of people who are not white men. So the University of California system, again, I don't have to tell any of you that much about this, but I do love this line that I dug up while working on the book from one of Ronald Reagan's advisors about why they needed to introduce tuition at the University of California system, which was, "We are in danger of producing an educated proletariat. That's dynamite. We have to be selective on who we allow to go through higher education." So more on protests, of course, later, but of course, Reagan called in the National Guard to crush all the student protests at the university when he was instituting tuition. So, everything that's happening now has happened before, except slightly differently. The first bums, as Aaron Beatty and Mike Conzel wrote, that Ronald Reagan threw off welfare were California university students. So from that moment, from the sort of, let me restate that. So basically, as the entire working class is getting access to institutions like the City University of New York and the University of California system, it began to horrify people like Ronald Reagan, and they decided that they had to figure out ways to keep the proletariat from getting educated. And that is, this is happening at the same time as many, many, many other things. And the target that gets painted on the backs of university professors in particular, but broadly professionals, right? As Barbara Ehrenreich noted, the new class was a favorite argument of right-wingers of that period, saying that this was the liberal elite, actually, that was imposing socialism on everyone else, never mind the contradictions. And this is actually a way to decompose the professional managerial class, which I am not convinced was ever a class in the first place, but still. So the managerial side began doing better than ever, right? Executive pay has been going upwards since the late 1970s, despite the declining profits in Joshua's graph. And the professionals, meanwhile, have been doing less well. And the polarization in the academic profession, again, I don't have to tell any of you about because you're living it. So what happens when this idea of a period of apprenticeship, that you will pay your dues and you will eat some shit and live and pay 75% of your income in rent for a few years, but then after that you'll get tenure and you'll get a great job and it'll all be worth it and you'll have the last good job in America, in Stanley Aronowitz's words, for the rest of your life, when that's no longer true and the eating shit seems to be your permanent class position, actually. So the professional managerial class is dead, if it ever existed. We can argue about that if anybody wants to. I guess you probably don't. A university degree is 1,400% more expensive than it was when the Ehrenreichs first came up with the term professional managerial class. And we're still asking questions about what higher education is for, right? Is it to produce a credential? Or is it actually to create an educated proletariat, or perhaps to, end class society entirely? Just a thought. So the labor of love exists less than it ever did. And by unionizing, you see a way through that, right? To not identify as the future managerial class of America, but as workers who are also in crappy working conditions like so many other workers around the country. And yeah. So before I sort of wrap up here, just about the protests that are going on now, which I think are connected to all of these things. So I don't need to tell any of you again about police violence and university police violence. But I think to understand what's going on in the streets right now, we have to see it as sort of the cumulative effect of all of the protests, riots, uprisings of the past decade, and then beyond that, and then, a rebellion against something that has been central to this country since its founding, which is, of course, white supremacy. And that's why the National Guard is there. That's why the militarized police are coming out in such numbers. And that's why they can't back down, even as politicians sort of find some demands to give into around the edges. But this is also, of course, a fight about funding priorities. It's interesting that this time around, people have really coalesced around the demand to defund the police. That, people are kind of laughing off the oh, we'll have some more body cameras, we'll have some more reforms, because we've seen that didn't work, right? We got promised that after Ferguson. It hasn't worked. It's been crap. And when we're arguing about funding priorities, once again, we're talking about the way that university systems that used to be free and then are yanked back. We're talking about what the American state is there for, right? What is the purpose of this thing? Is it there to provide free education? Is it here to provide healthcare? Well, we've got an answer to that one so far. Roads, basic social services, or is it here just to police us and produce a compliant reserve army of labor? So the image that we get right now is the latter, right? And the fights for the former are all connected, whether that is a funded and cared for university system or ending the police. So I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit. This is my second Zoom call of the day, and I think it's probably better that I just let y'all ask me some questions. So I don't know how to do orders.
Yeah.
Oh, Molly's going to do stack. Beautiful. Wonderful. Thank you.
Right. Katie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you. I'm curious what you see in your own utopian ideal society as the role of higher education. This is something that I'm just exploring in my own mind, and I want to hear as many opinions as possible.
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, right? Because like, when you look at the history of these institutions, sometimes it's easy to be like, well, is this even redeemable? Should we throw it out entirely? And, you know, I had a great time at the university. I had a great time as an undergrad. I had a great time as a grad student. And I do think that there's something wonderful about just bringing together a bunch of people from different backgrounds in a place where, you know, often they're not from, and throwing them in to learn from each other. And yeah, I mean, my utopian society, like, we've abolished wage labor, so that brings up some interesting questions about what the university might look like. What does learning look like without it being someone's job to teach? I don't know. Yeah, I just think I hate deeply that, you know, the university now is just a path to a credential. I think that is just depressing. Like, it makes me fucking sad that so many people are business majors, because that just seems like a terrible way to spend 4 years of your life. Not to mention the rest of your life, like being in business, whatever the hell that means, is also a terrible way to spend your life. But like, God, being a business major, that just sounds so miserable. Like, I was an English major, which is not terribly useful, but it was a lot of fun. I don't know if we have another one.
Tony, do you want to go?
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I could unmute myself. Thanks so much for this, Sarah. I wanted to, I don't really have a question, but I wanted to hear about histories of the UAW. Feeling really quite sad. Union bargaining team said no on on allowing a strike vote. And just what you said about kind of like unionization allows you a way to see yourself as workers and gives you this kind of like, I don't know, whatever identity through labor. Like, I don't know, other people who are more involved with the leadership might have a different perception, but kind of what I've been seeing is that like, because like the people in the union are so defensive of the union that like any kind of self-criticism comes as like an existential threat is read as an existential threat to the union. The sort of doubling down on like any small gains that could be won through the union. And there was this weird thing as well when we were on strike here at Santa Cruz, that like crap journalists who hadn't done their research would come up to us and be like, oh, you're on strike like because you want to like get a union, right? And we're like, no, it's we've had a union.
Yeah.
Strike has, well, we're part of the union. Yeah, I don't know. That's not really a question, but just.
Yeah, no, yeah, I mean, the UAW, you know, I did not watch it yesterday, but my buddy Chris Brooks at Labor Notes was watching the, you know, former president of the UAW, you know, plead guilty. So that was the thing that happened yesterday. And yeah, like, if we don't criticize the union, then the only people who are saying that it's fucked up that the president of the UAW was corrupt is the right, and they just want to do that to destroy unions. So like, I think it's incredibly, incredibly important to have internal critique of the union that is nevertheless like 100% supportive of the fact that you should have a union. Because otherwise the only place to go when the union does something bad is to be like, well, fuck the union, just decertify the union, get rid of unions. Unions are terrible. Unions just fucked me over. If we don't actually have a conversation about what the union is for and what it should be for and whether it's fulfilling that purpose, then what what is the union, right? If the union isn't everybody who's a member of it being able to participate in debate about what it is, then what is the union? Then it's some guys at a house in Detroit who are embezzling money, and that's a shitty thing for the union to be. And it's always been a shitty thing for the union to be, even when they weren't embezzling money, right? I remember talking to Ruth Milkman about this, about the history of the UAW at the end of the GM strike. And actually, I'll find the link to that and put it in the chat, because we did a belabored episode on it that was really good. And she was saying that, you know, the UAW has a lot of things you can historically criticize it for, but corruption was not one of them for a very long time. This was sort of a new and depressing turn of events. And, you know, it's I don't know, the GM strike, it's just, now that I've brought that up, I'm depressed about it again. The way that, like, there's everyone, okay. The way that the union essentially called that strike with no plan, right? Talk about not having a plan. They had no idea what they were going to do. My dog wants to come say hi. I don't know if you can see him on my desktop computer. And surprisingly, they got nowhere with their lack of plan. And yeah, that comes from having a top-down union structure where the members didn't really feel like they were involved and had ownership over the strike, where their desire to stay out or go back in was not really, there's the dog, not really considered that important. There wasn't that much space for debate. There wasn't a lot of conversation. You know, when I went out to the picket line that's near me in Pennsylvania, the workers were kind of like, yeah, we don't really know what's going on. That's just a shit way to have a union. And also because I've been talking a lot about the value of, well, not the value of, the horror that was the purging of the communists from the labor movement, and particularly from the UAW, and had some arguments about that on Twitter recently. The history there, right, was that, like, at one time, Walter Reuther and the people around him wanted the UAW and the CIO broadly to be a force, not just in the workplace, but in American politics and American political life. And they did believe in contesting for control in, not just in, again, like, sort of not just for bread and butter issues on the factory floor, but actually control over production. And that all went out the window with the Treaty of Detroit. And the communists went out the window soon afterward because they had done what the leadership needed them to do, right? Which was to actually organize the unions into existence. And then after that, they were too messy because they didn't like cutting deals with the bosses. And so that history, you know, it doesn't just go away. The fact that, like, the American labor movement in particular has a history of throwing people out for being too radical. That's not gone. And it's interesting right now to see the labor movement sort of contesting and dealing with these issues internally, right? Like, there have been some great statements from some local unions about, and some, you know, union leaders around the country about the fact that protesters, you know, graffitied and smashed some windows of the AFL-CIO building. And people are saying, like, why didn't those people see this as the home of a movement that fights for them? And that's on us. And I think that's a real moment to sort of, you know, now I'm rambling again into entire questions about the, you know, the entire labor movement. But, like, so Taylor Garland, who works for Sarah Nelson at the Flight Attendants Union this morning, just went on a, you know, Twitter rant about, like, she's been trying to get them to put a Black Lives Matter sign or something up at the AFL-CIO just to be like, look, like, we should be clear about which side we're on here. And they wouldn't do it. And instead she saw them, they actually just put boards over the AFL-CIO sign. And, like, what kind of message does that send, y'all? You know, it's just depressing. So I think not just the UAW, but unions in general have a long history in this country of not really actually liking debate that much, of not actually really wanting to be democratic, and particularly not wanting to have to grapple with the uncomfortable and messy questions of like, what is it that we really want? Is it just like higher wages, or is it actually control over the means of production? And yeah, well, that's depressing. I hadn't seen that they had voted against the democratic reform, so that's
Oh, sorry. I messaged you privately by mistake, I realized, for SAC. But hi, thank you so much for that. Also a angry former head steward, now just rank and filer from UAW 2865. But one of the, so we talk about democracy.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was an argument with this vote is like, before we can get to the democracy of rank and file, we need the strategic layer of bargaining team members who actually, you know, have a better sort of like managerial almost understanding of what's going on at this higher level. And we're also seeing, I think, similar things in the critiques of protesters in the Black Lives Matter movement, where it's like, there needs to be this professional managerial strategy is conflated almost exclusively with things that involve negotiation with the boss directly and in their language. And it got me thinking a lot about, like, when we talk about democracy, what do we even mean if this is sort of tying back to your question, to the question about what education is for as well. It's like, if the populace is not educated in how this works and cannot be by its very far, like, I know a lot of utopian leftists too, who will sort of talk about like, well, we should just have every worker read Marx. And I'm not sure if that's like the solution either necessarily, or if it's the only solution, that like class consciousness only comes from a particular kind of education. But
That's
but it does just, yeah, right. Yeah, so I know I don't really believe in class consciousness either necessarily as a concept, but like it's just very yeah, I mean, I would say, I'll just conclude with a personal anecdote, which is that it's sort of telling that like a lot of these conversations are things that I'm having in the university and a humanities program for the most serious time in my life, but like I'm almost 30 and I still don't understand how I've lived through 2 recessions, and like how the actual, like I'm still trying to figure out how the last one happened as like the new one's happening, and we all are. And so just, yeah, trying to figure out how a union can be democratic, how a movement can be democratic, when we have different definitions of democracy. And I think that actually was something that literally someone from our bargaining team said, that I guess we just have different definitions of what's democratic when we were talking about how not having the vote was undemocratic.
So it's funny because you kind of end up with this like professional managerial vanguard party, right? Like it's like this weird mashup of like managerialism and Leninism, where it's like, well, we're the vanguard and we're going to tell you what is whatever, but it's also like, but we're also the only ones who are prepared to negotiate with the rulers. So I spent a lot of today in between doing things that I actually needed to do today, being mad on the internet about people saying dumb things about police and prison abolition, because like you get, oh God, these dudes who work for Vox, basically, which like saying like, well, police abolition, prison abolition just seem like really badly thought out ideas. And it's like, read a book by a Black woman, you assholes. You know, just like, what the fuck? But it is literally like, right, like when you're saying like particular type of education, hello, whose voice do we think is important? Even if Ruth Wilson Gilmore is a fucking distinguished professor, apparently she's still not distinguished enough for people to have read anything she's ever written. And yeah, this idea that like, A, I just want to separate these two things, right? Like A, that like these ideas aren't well thought out in a way that is like legible to some certain group of, you know, white men who speak professionalese, and which is A, it's fucking false, right? Like, hi, Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore come out, including the University of California system, in fact, you know, are in academia, are like credentialed up the wazoo. Like, you cannot possibly argue that like these people are not people who like have well thought anything out. And also, like, I have heard better explanations of class consciousness from kids on the fucking streets with a brick in their hand than I've ever read in FUC. So like, you know, you just like, it's not actually, you don't need to have read Capital Volume 1 to understand that you're exploited. Nobody who works at McDonald's has any illusions about their own exploitation, right? Like, part of the thing about this whole labor of love garbage that I'm writing about is that it is turned on a lot of people who are in positions where like they maybe have a less clear understanding of their own exploitation, despite the fact that, you know, you're more educated or whatever. We're in, you know, the media, we're in academia, we're in whatever. We can be sort of convinced that like we're not exploited like the guy at McDonald's is, because our boss is maybe nicer to us. Because my byline means something. They can't treat me like shit like they did 10 years ago. But somebody's still making a profit off of my labor, you know? And this shit's not actually that hard to figure out. And so I'm just like, I'm so deeply tired of these really disingenuous arguments about like who gets it and who's smart enough to get it. And it's real funny to me to like make those added group of grad students like, oh, you just don't understand. Like, for fuck's sake, we're in a grad program. Tell me what I need to read in order to understand it. Like, come on, you know, that's just a ridiculous argument. But I think, yeah, I like this idea of the professional managerial vanguard. I'm gonna have to write something about that because I think it's really funny. As I was saying, I'm unconvinced that the professional managerial class was ever a class, but it was definitely described a set of working conditions, I guess is the best way to put it. And people mistake that for power all the time. And if there is one thing I have learned in 40 years on this planet, it is that like slightly nicer working conditions can always get worse.
We have Ben on Stack.
Hi, thank you all. So I don't know, I might be the only non-graduate student here.
Hey, that's cool.
I'm contingent faculty, and as somebody who was involved in both a failed union drive as a grad student and then a 4.5-year failed union drive as a contingent faculty member, I guess I kind of want to pick up on where you left off, Sarah. And first I want to say thank you for all the really terrific work you do.
Thank you.
You're not a lone voice, but one of far too few voices talking about labor. And you're terrific to teach to undergrads was the other thing, because you're
yay, good. That's what I like to hear.
Clear and passionate writer in ways that, you know, some of my nerdy stuff doesn't quite hit. But I kind of want to ask about if in working on this new book, you encountered ways to counter the seduction of the love your work ideology, because in both of those failed union drives, that is endemic in academic work. Whether we think of it as class consciousness or not, folks are pretty attached to the notion that they're not workers in really weird ways. And it was, and when you don't have that attachment, sometimes it's hard to make convincing arguments when you just kind of want to be like, can't you just see? Because it turns out that's not really a good way to get people on your side. So I was just wondering if you did come across like arguments or ways of talking about it, or events that kind of really shifted folks away from that love your job, I'm not a worker because I love what I do mentality. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that, you know, we always say like the boss is the best organizer, and unfortunately, that still sort of continues to be true, right? When people have crappy experiences with a manager, their advisor, something like that, that tends to be the moment where they're like, oh, wait, like this is, this actually kind of sucks. And yeah, there's a lot about this whole narrative that is really, really insidious, right? Like, especially when you get people who are coming to the university as a form of upward mobility, right? It is more fun to be a journalist than it was to wait tables. Like I did that for 10 years of my life. It sucked. I really hope I never have to go back to it. But also I think because I have done that work, I also see the similarities between what I do now and what I did then. I firmly believe that waiting tables is a great way to teach interviewing skills. So, and I think it makes me a better journalist, but like, particularly when grad school is sort of seen as the up escalator to something that isn't work, or even if it is the last good job in America, that kind of thing, it's really hard to let go of that. And I think the best and also most depressing thing to tell people about right now in order to break that is just like some facts about the likelihood of getting a tenure track job, which like, I don't want to depress any of y'all, but it's, you know, it's really fucking bad. And it's only about to get way worse because like all of these funding battles, although maybe the uprising will lead to some actual cuts to police budgets that we can put back into other things, which would be great. But yeah, I think one of the things that I wanted to do in doing this book, and sort of the book is arranged in 10 chapters of 10 different kinds of work, is that by the time you get to the academia chapter in the book, that's chapter 8, and you've been through a bunch of other places and seen where this narrative is used on like retail workers. You know, so you can look at it in a condition that isn't yours. And maybe once you look at it in a condition that isn't yours, you can see how it works on yours. Because one of the things, I used to write a lot about student debt. And that was one of the first things that I, like 10 years ago, people started actually asking me to come give talks about. And university students are always, always so worried about their own privilege, except for the ones that are total assholes. But like the ones that aren't total assholes are just like, but isn't it privileged for me to like complain about my own student debt? Because aren't I lucky to have the student debt at all? And so I would have to just be like, no, actually, like you don't create solidarity by being like, well, I'm too privileged to talk about my own working conditions and my own indebtedness. You create solidarity by showing up for people in their struggles, and then they show up for you in yours. And so I think, you know, on some level, I hope that the usefulness of this book for grad students and academics and people who, you know, on some level are probably the most likely ones to read the damn thing, is that they can look at this narrative and see, like, as it comes through history and as it comes through other kinds of work, how it's gotten to them and how it's just as much bullshit when it's applied to you at the University of California as it is when it's applied to somebody who works at Toys R Us. That's my hope anyway.
I'm just going to introduce Molly, who has a question.
I just blatantly put myself on Stack. And I don't know where we are with time, but maybe we could do like a soft close of Stack. So by the time we work on this question, we'll just kind of see where we go with time. But I kind of want to follow up on what Ben said, because I feel like I have heard a lot of the arguments this week against why a strike authorization vote should be handed down to the rank and file. And again, it does seem to hinge on this: we should love what we do. And the biggest sort of thing is that, well, if we withhold our labor, if we hold a great strike, and of course Santa Cruz has already gone through this, and that is somehow harmful to undergraduates. And that, as you know, we should love what we do, but what we love, in loving what we do, it should be sort of a caretaking thing in a way for we teach, and that, you know, we have to choose to kind of be sort of in solidarity with our fellow grad workers, or sort of this sort of big idea of in solidarity with our students. And that there's sort of a betrayal that happens. And so a big push that was sort of, I heard this sort of last couple of days was, well, we can't practically do something that would be harmful for the undergraduates. So on the one hand, there's this kind of confused idea of what a grad student is, because then that's kind of a strange idea of, well, we should love what we do, and therefore, I kind of understand what you're saying, and therefore that should sort of prevent us from a collective action in that sense. There's also the other kind of idea, we are also sort of consumers of the university, and you get people like my dad are kind of saying, well, caveat emptor, you know, like you knew what you're going into as a grad student, that you're not paid anything, which is this weird kind of confusing of us as like a consumer, employee, staff, student. And so I think that all of these things just kind of come in at all angles, and all of them are kind of like suppressive sort of tendencies to kind of prevent us from mobilizing.
Yeah, you know, I meant to mention this earlier, and then I totally forgot, but I just finished reading an excellent book, which is called Coerced by Erin Hatton, who is she's a professor at the University of Buffalo. She also wrote a wonderful book called The Temp Economy. I am a huge fan of hers. But the new book is really interesting because so she looks at 4 different types of workers: prison labor, workfare, like welfare to work programs, graduate students in the sciences, and university athletes. And she has come up with this term that she calls status coercion, which is a different kind of labor coercion than all the normal things that, you know, like most of us work under economic coercion, right? We all have to eat. But in these particular cases, she says that the other thing that comes into play is this idea of like being in good status or not status, and all of these jobs are done by people who aren't really considered workers. And so there's always this play on whether what you're doing is work or not. And it's really interesting because, yeah, this tension that gets thrown at grad students and also student athletes is like, well, you're a student when they want you to be a student, and you're a worker when they need you to be a worker, but they can shift between those two things whenever it's convenient. And that way, you know, the definition, oh God, we did another belabored about this a long time ago about the Northwestern case. And the way that shifting status is a weapon that's used against people. So anyway, that book is great. And then the other thing, I'm going to find the link to the book, but the question of like being in solidarity with your students. I mean, I would just say that is a complicated thing, right? Like teachers' unions have been dealing with this and working on this issue for a while, because the first thing that anybody says when teachers go on strike is, what about the students, right? Don't you care about the students? You don't care about the children. What about the children? Blah, 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 right? We've all heard that. And the way that the teachers really have begun to undermine that argument is by organizing with their students and organizing with the community and saying, we are striking for, you know, our students' learning conditions are our working conditions. We're striking for toilet paper in the bathrooms and soap in the bathrooms and the kids to have recess. You know, some of you are in Los Angeles, and the, you know, Los Angeles Teachers Union has done incredible work at this. And in fact, one of my favorite LA teachers who is in this book is a teacher at the UCLA, whatchamacallit, lab school in Koreatown. So yeah, I think that the teachers' unions have done a really, really good job of making it clear that like it is in the students' interests to have teachers who are fed and have break periods where they can do their prep and can pay their bills and can afford to live in the city where they teach. And also that like the broader questions of defunding the university, of the cost of the, you know, thing of the education, that's not, you know, it's not even going into the pockets of tenured professors, let alone of grad students and adjuncts, right? That money is going somewhere else. And so to make an argument about, back to the first question, like what a university should be in solidarity with your students is going to require finding the points of leverage. And that's going to require all sorts of things that might be short-term, slightly painful for the students. Although, you know, I would also suggest that perhaps the students wouldn't mind if you skipped exams. I would not have. when I was an undergrad. But that kind of thing is, again, it's countered by good organizing, I think, less than good arguments. You can make the argument all you want, but if nobody has heard it in the community, they're not going to be on your side. So I think that that's a question of, like, you know, getting undergrads to be on your side there and to understand this and to have a shared vision of what the university is for, that isn't producing student debt and maybe a credential that maybe somewhere gets you a job. And, you know, weirdly, this pandemic and this massive economic crisis and now these uprisings, I think, create more opportunities for that conversation, because everyone's conditions are shitty right now. And the students are wondering if they're ever going to be back on campus, what an education is going to look like, if it's just going to look like this forever. And having a vision for what it looks like on the other side of this that actually is better for everyone. I think that's really possible. And I think that's really important. And it cuts the legs out from under this, like, you don't care about the students. It's like, well, I care about the students much more than the administrator sitting up in his office there does, or whoever it was that decided to spend all the money on a new football stadium or whatever it is that they're spending dumb money on at the U of C system right now. What are some of the dumb things they're spending money on these days?
Puppies. Yeah.
Wait, they're spending money on puppies?
Yeah, they come in to de-stress students during finals week.
I mean, I'm all for puppies, but, like, what?
Wellness initiatives we could talk about.
God. Yeah.
Tony, did you want to, I feel like I baited you in the chat with the student contact.
Well, yes, they're definitely spending money on cops. We know that.
Oh, I was just going to say, to the whole student worker distinction, it's only seemed to just fuck us at every hurdle. Like, I think it fucks us in terms of, like, the more we could do to make the work we do as students be read as work and to self-describe as workers when we're doing that is better. I don't know so much about this, but as I understand, like, you know, there are other countries where you're seen as like a researcher, like at least Germany and Denmark and Sweden and places like that. But we're just facing this, like, you know, we were fired as workers and then we are disciplined as students through student conduct summons processes. Even this, at Santa Cruz, we got this $2,500 housing stipend, which was meant to be this like big thing that was revealed to end the strike, which is, you know, inadequate. But they're in the middle of a long deliberation period to see whether people who were fired can get this stipend because they don't seem to have worked out the boundaries of what being in good status is, particularly. So
status, like, there's the thing, right?
Right. It's arbitrary and it's really bad. So anyway,
Yeah. I mean, it's that question of, like, where can they most exercise power over you, right? As students or as workers, and they will shift in that direction. And that's just, it's so much.